that's something. Figured, better than nothing, right? But yeah, that it actually happens fairly often. It's gotten better. We replaced certain cables and it improved. But it usually happens before the early service, and we have plenty of time to fix the issue. So it might mean, we bought that camera early into COVID, so the camera's 5 years plus old at this point. So maybe it's that the camera is just not doing what it's supposed to be doing anymore. I don't know. Like I said, we have been periodically attempting to troubleshoot the issue. Because it does still work. It just doesn't always turn itself on. And it rarely does it when it's not left on for a weekend or something like that. So the fact that it was doing it late service is weird. Such as life. Yeah, so got a microphone. I have no idea if it'll pick you up. We'll find out after we do this tonight, and we'll listen to it and see if we can hear any of you. But like I said, I don't know if any of you, you're in the class, so there's no real reason to necessarily, but if you do listen to the podcast version of this, you do get just long periods of silence while I'm listening to you all ask questions. And then it's always me saying, right, and then going into something. Yeah. And so, yeah.
That's when I just had to quit listening to them in the gym. There was nothing to listen to.
Right, yeah, for little bits of time. So hopefully this will help alleviate that a little bit. Hopefully also, a potential issue is because we got two microphones. It's going to sound all sorts of weird with me talking. That's why I pointed towards you and not way back there or anything. So we'll see. We'll play around with it. Speaking of podcast, Joe and I it's officially done. We're done with it. It's in the hands of the editor at this point. The series that we did, talking our way through the Didache. Which is...
I slugged through the first one, but I can't get going on the second one.
Okay, well, I was going to say the first one's probably the hardest because that's where we don't actually talk about any of the words.
That's what I keep telling myself.
Yeah.
But I still haven't started the next one.
All right, well, because in the first one we just go over background stuff, where it came from, and it's got an interesting story. But anyway, so definitely check that out. Going through the Didache there, some of the early Christian texts, right? Didache being one that is unlikely, but potentially written before any of the New Testament books and still after Christ. So it is potentially extremely early, more likely closer to the year 100 or so, somewhere in that range. But anyway, check that out. I guess that's my plug for today. So today, we're beginning our fall series. We're going to be looking through, I don't have a really smooth way of saying this. I want to call this the miracles of John, but John doesn't do any of the miracles. And so it's the miracles of Jesus, but I don't look at any of the other books outside of John for this class. We're staying in that book. And the miracles of Jesus, according to John, is a mouthful. So whatever this is going to eventually be titled, on my notes here, I have miracles in John, which, I don't know, doesn't sound great anyway, but, is what it is. So we're today going to start with what John describes as the first of Jesus' miracles, the turning of water into wine at the wedding of Cana. This is in John chapter 2, if you want to turn to that. We will be working our way through the text. Although I will say, I don't plan on doing this, running this class like I've done most of my, to use the fancy term, exegetical classes. We're not, I don't think, we'll see what ends up happening, but we're not going to go line by line, verse by verse, really digging in and looking at this whole big scheme. We're going to be doing more of a free-form look. This is a topical class, even though we're staying in one book of the Bible. We're going to be skipping through it, because we're not going to be reading really anything in between any of the miracles. Now, I was tempted, actually, to not start with the wedding at Cana, to start with what certainly can be described as a miracle, and it is also described in the book of John, although in a very different way, and that would be the incarnation. Very tempted to begin the class on the incarnation, and perhaps I should have. As I was reading through some of the church fathers and what they have to say about the wedding at Cana, they are referencing the incarnation constantly. So the early church saw a connection between the incarnation of Christ and the wedding at Cana. And we'll hit on little bits of it here and there as we go through how they're making that connection. But I thought mostly because we've done Christology like 3 different times in this class, and John isn't a narrative of the birth of Christ, that we just skip to what John calls the first of Jesus' signs. Bill, looks like you already got a question for me.
I'll reserve it.
Oh, you'll reserve.
No, I've often, this text is often read at weddings or even preached on.
Mm-hmm.
I've always thought that was a strange text.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with the wedding.
We'll get back to that. I got a quote for you. It's in there, though. Yeah, so the idea of this being used, it's got the word wedding in there. So it's already, quite frankly, it's more connected to weddings than that 1 Corinthians text that we all use, right? Because what's Paul talking about in 1 Corinthians? Love, love is patient, love is kind, doesn't, right? All of that, if I speak in tongues of angels when I have not love, I'm a noisy gong and clashing. So all of that, right? The wedding text. What's he talking about?
The church.
Church fellowship, right? Absolutely. Now, I will say, I don't have any room to talk because my wedding text was Ruth chapter 1. So my wedding text was love between 2 women, mother-in-law, daughter-in-law situation. So I think contextually we can move things around. Anyway, I guess you could say that this has more to do with weddings than the Corinthians text. Well, we'll talk about that, right? And in fact, just because it's not a huge thing I was going to dive into, the early church spent a lot of time trying to deal with the fact that Jesus is at a wedding banquet, which sounds strange, right? I mean, how many of you have ever been to a wedding, what do we call them now, reception, right? How many of you been to a wedding reception? Yeah, I mean, all of you, right? And so we don't think anything of it, but the church fathers see this as a strange thing, that Jesus is partying with a whole bunch of people in a at least vaguely sensuous circumstance, and they in many ways they go to Jesus' defense. This is why he's here. He's not. In fact, one of the quotes I was planning on bringing up is, Jesus wasn't there to party. He was there to display his power. And that's a big deal for the early church. Now, there's some contextual differences with the early church, right? You have Gnosticism is existing, so they got to deal with that, avoiding fleshly things. And so they have to kind of figure that out. They're also looking towards an ethic of asceticism in much of the early church. And they're trying to balance, hey, it's okay to enjoy things. Jesus does this. Also, you look to groups, pre-Christian groups, Jewish groups, if you will, that influence kind of the culture of 1st and 2nd century Christianity. One of them is the Essenes, right? You've heard of these. We think John the Baptist might have been one of them. A group that's extremely similar to them is the ones that did the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? They're not technically Essenes, but for practical purposes, they are. One of their highlighting factors is that they did not have kids. Neither did they marry. And so you have this sort of, and that was seen as a very holy thing, right? And so you have kind of this cultural background going in as well. And so the fact that Jesus is at a wedding was pretty significant to the early church. And they talk about Jesus sanctifying marriage through this and doing all sorts of other things like that. And I don't think that we would necessarily pull out of this text. But yeah, I don't know if that's more information than you wanted on that or not. So before we do dive into, oh, go ahead, Tom.
Oh, when we lived in Wisconsin, we were up with the Norwegians, and the Norwegians do not drink, they're really big on that. And so there was a meeting where they were talking about this, and somebody said, well, Jesus used wine. And this one lady said, well, yeah, but if you would have known how much trouble it was going to cause, I don't think you would have done it.
Oh, that's crazy. What I've heard, yeah, that's a wild take.
Well, our church, when we started and had dedication for the church, invited this congregation from Eau Claire to come, and we cooked bratwurst in the park. And the way you do that is you boil it in beer first, and then you put it on the grill. When they found out it had been boiled in the beer, they wouldn't eat it.
They lost their mind. Yeah, that's an interesting take. The one I typically hear from that kind of crowd is that the reason it's good wine and new wine is that it's not wine; it's grape juice. They just didn't have a word for it, which they do. Right? They had grape juice too. It didn't last very long, but I mean, you squeeze a grape, juice comes out. It existed back then. So they would have known what that tastes like. Anyway, I've heard more of that than Jesus didn't know how bad it would get. So, which is, that's an interesting take. Anyway, so before we dive deeply into the wedding at Cana, I want to kind of take a step back and look at miracles thematically, if you will, throughout the Bible. Right? So as of right now, we're zooming out of John and we're zooming out of Jesus' ministry itself, right? Because we know that miracles are happening outside of the ministry of Jesus, right? Miracles happen in the Old Testament. Do miracles happen after Jesus? Yes. I mean, one of my favorite ones, just because it's humorous to me, is Paul raises a young man from the dead, right? Do you know why he has to raise him from the dead? Because he was preaching in such a boring way that the man fell asleep and dropped out the window, right? And so in Book of Acts, right? It's in there. So we see miracles are happening after Jesus, but of course, most of the miracles that we think of that aren't Jesus miracles in the Bible are Old Testament miracles. So let's start out. What are some miracles that, when you think Old Testament miracles, right? We're going to stay out of the New Testament for right now. When you think Old Testament miracles, what comes to mind?
Crossing the Red Sea.
Red Sea. Ooh, that's a good one, right? We got 2 Red Seas. Good. What else?
Elijah and the widow with the oil, didn't they?
Okay, yeah, Elijah and the widow with the oil and the flour, right? Naaman, yeah, the Syrian who's healed by Elisha. Yes, Elisha.
Daniel might get eaten by the lions.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I would put that in there, right? Daniel not being eaten, because the lions had a snack right after that, right? I mean, that was a miraculous sort of event. Yes, absolutely. Right, the 3 young men in the fire, right? Good. Yeah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Good. Any others? I mean, there's definitely more. We're not going to do an exhaustive.
The whole trek out of Egypt.
Right. The entire Exodus account in the first chunk is a huge. In fact, that makes it into the list I have here.
Manna from
snakes on the ground.
Manna. The snakes. That's interesting. So would you? I'm going to push in on that. Are you calling the snakes the miracle or the bronze snake the miracle?
No, I was thinking of when he threw his staff down.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you're in a different place than I am. Because with the one I'm thinking, it might be both. But yeah, right. So looking into the plagues in general, but especially those displays of power right at the beginning, right? You remember Moses had 2 things that he did? We all know that he threw the staff down and it became a snake. What else did he do?
He struck the rock, didn't he?
That's far later.
Different one, okay.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with the staff. This is a sign to show to the Egyptians.
He put his hand in his shirt.
That's it. He put his hand in his robe and it came out leprous. And then he put it in again and it was fine, right? That one we forget about because it's less dramatic than, even though I think it's in the Charlton Heston thing. Anyway. Yeah, okay, so we got a ton of miracles surrounding Moses and the Exodus. Good. Any others that stand out?
Maybe David and Goliath.
See, I'm going to say David and Goliath probably no.
Either a random hit or.
So here's the thing, right? And I can show you all after. I think when we, as modern readers, hear David fighting with a sling, we think like, the kid's toy slingshot. That's not what this was. First of all, David with his sling, and actually Judah just read this the other night, right? David with his sling boasts about regularly killing lions and bears. This is not a pea shooter, right? Also, when you kind of think, oh, well, okay, it's the one that you spin and you let go, and you think, okay, that's probably pretty good. And then you fast forward and you realize that like Alexander the Great is running around with slingers, and they are decimating armies with them. You can go through armor with a good slinger, can go through and do pretty significant damage even through armor. There are videos online you can watch of like modern day people using slings, and it is wild. All of a sudden you think, oh, it wasn't that exciting that David killed Goliath with a sling. Now, it's still a big deal because Goliath had a shield and he's a big, strong warrior, and David's still a child, right? That's more of the issue. In fact, what does Goliath say to David? Remember?
Am I a dog? Did you come out with me a child?
Yeah. Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks and stones? He's not worried. He's not recognizing the sling aspect of this. That would have gotten him more nervous because that is a legitimate war weapon, right? He's like, this is a kid playing with sticks and like rocks in the stream, right? And that's who you think? So there's some of that. And I think, okay, this is a good one. What I want to avoid is this sense of whenever God has his hand in anything, it's a miracle, right? I mean, David even says, right, God is the one fighting for me, I'll be fine, right? But I think, at least in my sense, going into this class, I think I would say that that's something slightly different, right? Now, I don't have a really hard definition for miracle, right? And I'm not sure if you guys do either, right? I would have thought that I did, right? And I mean, I think the easiest way to say it is God breaking into his creation and breaking the rules, right? Go ahead.
Oh, Israel was a suspension of the physical laws.
Yeah, and there's definitely an aspect of that, but a lot of the church talks about creation as a miraculous event. And creation is not a suspension of the natural laws, but the establishment of the natural laws, right? And so I think that's definitely a really good place to go with this, and it's definitely helpful. But I think this sense of miracles is probably broader or more narrow than we tend to think, right? Because if you get to the point where you say, well, a miracle is any time that God is working in his creation, then you got a problem. So maybe you say, well, it's only when God breaks the rules of the creation, if you will. Well, maybe. Maybe some of the healing miracles might not work there quite as well. And what do we call the exorcisms? And that's not breaking any physical laws. And those are certainly, or traditionally, those are classified as miracles too. Joe?
I was going to say, John makes a good point to remind us that miracles weren't for their own sake,
right?
But that they communicated.
Yeah, and so what we did, right? John makes this point clear. We're gonna hit on this as we transition into John, and we're gonna keep it in mind as we go throughout all the miracles here. But I sat down with Pastor Jordan. We did some brainstorming about kind of categories of miracles in the Old Testament. Well, all of our examples are from the Old Testament, but they're just in general, right? And so we identified in no particular order other than it's the order that we thought of them in, right? One, very close to you guys, plagues. What's the plagues? Plagues are God showing the sign of his mighty wonders with a strong and outstretched hand, right? So it's described using miraculous language. And that, I would say, again, these are brainstorm categories. These aren't, you won't find these listed out in Peeper or something like that. This is God showing his dominion over humanity and over idols, right? So, especially with the plagues, but you can kind of, well, especially with the plagues, you get the sense of, I think the easiest one for us to notice is the plague of darkness, right? The second to last plague, right, is the plague of darkness. And why is that such a, because the plagues ramp up, right? Why is darkness such a big deal for the Egyptians?
Their
Worship
God
the
was
sun
the
god.
sun god.
Yeah, the chief deity at this point in time in the Egyptian pantheon is Atum Ra, right? The disk of the sun. Well, God is showing, he's got nothing on me, right? Now, Joe and I talk about this in the podcast, but that does not mean that the Bible is acknowledging that Ra is a real God, right? But is showing, God is demonstrating that he's more powerful than humanity, Pharaoh in this sense. But you can look forward to like Gideon and God causing conflict within the camp, that kind of thing. And that he's more powerful than false gods as well.
What category does the resurrection of Jesus?
The resurrection of Jesus falls in its own category that's not in the Old Testament, Bill. No, I say that tongue in cheek. But we will be, now, when you look through the lists online, right, you Google the 7 miracles in John, Jesus' resurrection is not listed. We're going to spend a day talking about Jesus' resurrection, right? Because it is, well, what's the miracle that Jesus does right before the resurrection?
Raised from the dead.
Raising Lazarus from the dead.
Right.
And we're going to notice, as we are going through the book of John, now we're not hitting everything, but it's going to be really important for us to remember a couple of things as we are hitting our miracles, is that John was intended to be read out loud in one session, right? Now, we don't read the Bible that way very often, if ever, right? What that can do for us, and this is a drawback to the lectionary system that we do, is we isolate texts and say, oh, yes, the wedding at Cana. And then we don't look at what came before and what came after or any of that kind of stuff. We're going to notice that John is even more so than the other Gospels. John is extremely intentional about how he arranges things. Right? Why do I say even more than the other Gospels? Right? How are the synoptic Gospels organized? Do we know what that word means, synoptic, or that term?
Similar.
Yeah, well, yeah, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? How are the synoptic Gospels organized?
Somewhat chronological.
It is chronologically. Now, they don't always agree with the chronology in across them, and that's a whole topic all to itself. But internally, at least, they're chronological. What about John? Is John a chronologically organized book? No. Right? By the way, if you're looking at your headings, what does Jesus do immediately after the wedding at Cana in the Gospel of John? He goes and cleanses the temple, right? And this is him driving people out with the whips, right? When does Jesus do that? It depends on who you talk to, but traditionally, we see that as something he does on Holy Week, right? And now, there are enormous numbers of arguments surrounding the Gospel of John, but I think for our purposes here, since this is a miracles class, not a Gospel of John class, is John is arranging his book somewhat vaguely chronologically, right? Chronology has, you don't get the crucifixion after the resurrection, and so it's not entirely thematically, but it's mostly a thematically organized book. And so John put things where he put them, not simply because, oh, well, that's when they happened, right? He put them where he put them because he had a message he wanted to tell us as we went through it. We're going to hit on one of those items where John intentionally says something in the wedding at Cana that should get our ears to perk up and pay attention and go, oh, he's doing something here with the structure of how he puts it together, right? It's very similar to the book of Revelation, right? Although Revelation is messy in its own way that we talked about like a year or two ago. I don't remember anymore, right? But John doesn't write chronologically. It's just not the style he's using, right? It's not a strange thing for the people of his day.
His chronology is basically the church year.
Right, we do get some of that.
So even though it's a 3-year ministry, he basically puts it together in 1 year and gives you the festivals and associated themes with those festivals. So,
right, which is why during Advent we do Palm Sunday, right? And you know, I know how you brought it up, the 3-year ministry versus 1-year ministry of Jesus, and I think I've gone on my rant about this enough. I don't need to do it all over again. But, right, so we need to pay attention to how John is organizing things. And I don't remember how we got onto this specifically, but we were talking about plagues, power over humanity and idols, and then you said resurrection. That's right. And so we'll see how it builds up to the resurrection and how that's a critical aspect of what John is doing, where the resurrection really is a unique kind of miracle, right? Good. So the second kind of big category Pastor Jordan and I came up with were these miracles of deliverance, right? Red Sea. The ark to an extent, although if you're going to say the ark's a miracle, Tom, I know you know this, right? Then you got to mess around with your definitions of the physically possible, like breaking physical rules, right? I mean, I know that's the whole point of the Ark Museum, right? Is that God didn't have to break those rules to make the ark happen. You know, the fiery furnace, things of that nature, where God uses miracles to deliver people from whatever it is that is oppressing or harming them. The next category that we have, which is a bit of a strange one, we have miracles of remembrance. And so the sense we have here are things like the Passover, where the miracle occurs and with it comes this command to remember regularly. Every time in the Passover, every time you eat the Passover, remember the miracle that I did, right? The killing of the firstborn. Another place we see this is in the crossing of the Jordan River, right? Take the rocks out, pile them up so that you can remember who I am, right? And we see most of these in the Old Testament. The next is miracles of provision. Old Testament, we see, you know, manna, quail, water from the rock, Elijah being fed, you had the flour and oil, but even Elijah being fed by ravens, all of that kind of stuff. We have miracles as kind of proof texts, if you will, where God is just proving he is who he is. The one that came quickly to my mind is Gideon and his fleece, right? Remember this? God tells Gideon he's going to be the judge, and he says, well, okay, if you're really who you say you are, I'm going to put a fleece out. I don't know the order, remember the order, right? I want all the dew on the fleece and nothing on the ground. And then it happens. And he says, well, just in case, tomorrow I want the dew on the ground and not the fleece, right? God does these miraculous things to prove that he is who he says he is, basically. And then similar to that, but a little bit different, are miracles where God is revealing his character, right? The burning bush, Mount Carmel, he is showing who he is. And again, these aren't dogmatic categories. This is just kind of how we saw it. So, this is how God tends to use miracles throughout all of the Bible. All right? Questions on this kind of stuff, and then we'll zoom into John a little bit here.
There's an Oral Roberts category.
What was that?
Oral Roberts category.
What's that?
You don't know who Oral Roberts is?
Oral Roberts, not off the top of my head.
Oh,
Some evangelists
Such
go
a-
back.
Oh.
one of the OG televangelists.
Well, is he one of those signs and wonders guys where he
Oh, yeah.
slaps people on the forehead and...
Saw the 96-foot Jesus who told him to build a university.
Oh, God. Okay, so we're going to talk in this class about, and a question that I want you to keep in mind, I'm not going to answer it today, is do miracles still happen? Like I said, I don't want an answer in any way, and this isn't one of those Pastor Berlinski, I got trick question answers and things like that for you, right? My short answer is yes, I do think miracles are still happening, but I wouldn't use the term signs and wonders, because I think that that's a different thing. And so we'll deal with that as we work through this class. That's one of those back of mind questions, right? So we've talked a little bit about how God uses miracles throughout the entirety of Scripture, especially the Old Testament. So why does Jesus do miracles? What's going on with Jesus and his miracles?
That's what John says at the end, so that you guys might believe.
All right, yeah, so that is, that's going to be a key throughout this whole thing, right? So John chapter 20, and we're going to do both of the verses, right, to get the whole sentence in there. So John chapter 20, 30 and 31. Tell you what, does someone else want to read that for us?
I can read it.
Thanks, John.
Many other signs, therefore, Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name.
Yeah, so this is John's thesis. This is why he's writing the book. I say it applies to the entire Bible, but it certainly applies to his book, right? And so the key, why does Jesus do miracles specifically in the book of John? It's so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, right? And that by believing you may have life in his name, right? But notice that there's another sentence there, right? What is the first thing that the first thing that John says here in this sentence? Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. So we'll glean a few things from this. One, does Jesus do miracles that we don't know about? Yes, and to some sense we get hints at this, right? Jesus went to the town, healed the sick. We have no details about any of those. We know Jesus is doing miracles, right? John says there's stuff that we didn't write anything about, right? So the first thing we can kind of glean from this is, one, there are other reasons why Jesus does miracles other than the primary thing that John deals with, which is so that we might believe, right? And then the second is, the question I want to have us asking or answering every class is, why this miracle, right? So John had apparently tons of miracles to choose from, so put in his book. Yet these are the ones he chose. So we're going to ask, why did John choose to include the wedding at Cana? Why did he choose to include this miracle? Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, that's first in John 21, 25. There are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books which were written.
Right. So, I mean, part of the reason he doesn't include them is because there's not enough space, right? But let's think about this. We can kind of know on what we know about miracles in general. One is a huge one, is that Jesus is showing who he is and that we can believe in him, right? Why else does Jesus do miracles?
It says to show his divinity.
Right. So that's a huge part of it. I'm going to say that I've split this into two categories. So one is to show his divinity, right, which is kind of in line with more of what we've been talking about. Also to show his divinity in the sense of the power that he has. We'll see power over three major categories of this. That the miracles demonstrate Jesus' power over creation, over sin and its effects, right? So this would be not only the forgiveness of sins, but also healing and raising people from the dead, right? Sin and the effects that it has. Creation or this effects over sin, we could put the feeding of 5,000 in either of those, and we'll talk about that later. And then last is his power over Satan, right? The exorcisms are the big ones here. And so we see that Jesus is demonstrating his power over and over and over again. Another question that I want us to keep in the back of our minds as we do this, right? Jesus raised people from the dead. That's an exciting thing. So did Elijah. So does Paul. Jesus is not the only person. In fact, Elijah's bones raised someone from the dead. He didn't even do anything.
Yeah, a whole little city.
I know, right? It was fun, right? We talked about some dude who got thrown in a pit and he popped up because Elijah was in that pit, or at least his bones were, right? It's a weird story. But, Jesus calms he calms that tiny little lake, Galilee, right? But Moses split the Red Sea. So what's the difference? What is the difference? And I want us to, again, these are big questions that I don't want to answer right now. I want us to be thinking them through as we go through. And while the answer is because Jesus is doing it in his own power and, Moses and Elijah and all that weren't, how do you know that? Right? You know that because you've been told that, and people who've been told that. Let's look at this and see, well, from the Bible, right? Let's refresh ourselves. How do we actually know that this is different than what Moses is doing? Because the Pharisees don't think so. The more amenable Pharisees say, oh, you're like Elijah. You're like Moses, right? Quite frankly, that's what Islam teaches, is that Jesus is the greatest of these miracle workers that we see. Prophets, right, is what they would call them, just like Moses. So, in modern context, we see the Muslims say that about Jesus, right? The more hostile of the Pharisees, right, at one point say, it's not the power of God, it's the power of Satan that you're using, right? And so, how do we know that they're wrong? And how do we know that these miracles are Jesus demonstrating not that he's a conduit of God's power, but he is the incarnation of God's power, perhaps. He just isn't of himself, right? And in some ways that goes back to John's introduction, right? Look at that. We have both ends of John's gospel, right? These are written that you may believe, right? Part of it is that Jesus is God because he is the Word who is now dwelling among us. And then we see how that happens, right? Again, we're going to pay a lot of attention to the structure of the book of John, even though we're not doing a hard and fast exegetical run through of John, right? And the last, and I think this really goes to the miracles that we just don't hear anything about, is that Jesus performs miracles to show mercy, to show kindness and love, and just to help people. And I think that, I don't know if we always give it that quite as much credit as we probably should, right? Partly because it's not written out. And, we got fun miracles like the one coming up this Sunday where Jesus drags a guy with dropsy up in front of the Pharisees and he heals them to make a point, right? The guy, he gets healed, but he's almost, at least in the text, he's secondary to what Jesus is trying to teach through healing this man. And so you have that, but you also have, right, Jesus healed the crowds. Jesus is just doing these, he's showing mercy, right, because he's a God of mercy in a broken world that he's there to heal, right? And of course he does it in a big way in the resurrection, but he does it throughout his ministry as well. Good, any questions?
He also does it to show the person the power in his faith. Every one of them says, your faith has healed you.
Not every one of them, but a lot of them he talks about, right? And that goes, again, we're talking themes in John, right? John makes it very clear to us, right? Even though you got to get your Lutheran blinders off for a second, right? Just stick with me. It'll be okay, right? Let's see what I did there. John says that there is a work you must do to be saved. What is that work? It's to believe the words of the one, right? And so, right, we see that time and time again. You're absolutely right. Is Jesus is demonstrating it is faith that saves, right? And that the believing is what the people are doing. Is the only work of the Christian is to believe, right? Good. Now you put your Lutheran blinders back on because, by the way, we're in agreement with that sentence. But if you say you have to do a work to be saved, people freak out, rightfully so. But if you understand it as the only work the Christian does, and we've talked about this before, the only work a Christian does is to believe in Christ. I mean, that's faith alone, right there. Right? That's the whole shebang, right? Good. Anything else before we kind of dive into the wedding at Cana?
The Old Testament said he would.
Oh yeah. So there's definitely, and I hadn't included that, right? Jesus does miracles for the fulfillment of prophecy, right? You have what is John the Baptist? What does he ask? Or when he asked Jesus, here we go. When John the Baptist is in prison and he asks Jesus, "Are you the one, or shall we look to another?" What's Jesus' response?
Miracles.
Yeah, he alludes. It's not a direct quote, but he alludes to Isaiah, right? What do you see? The blind see, the deaf hear, the lame walk, right? This is Isaiah that he's quoting, right? And that's all John or anyone else needs to hear, right? Like if that's true, then he's the guy, right? So yes, yeah, absolutely, fulfillment of the Old Testament, absolutely. All right. So we already talked about how, as we're looking through the miracles in John, we need to keep in mind that concluding thesis, right? These are written that you may believe. So we're going to look primarily to that question of why this miracle was written so that we may believe. Why? How? Whatever way you want to phrase that question, right? Why did wedding at Cana, only John. This is the only account we have of the wedding at Cana. It doesn't appear in any of the other Gospels, right? So why does John include it? Especially when he is so precise about saying, hey, these are written for your belief, for your faith, right? And this is not, I'm not asking that question right now. This is, as we read through it, I want you to keep it in mind, right? Why does John include this miracle as opposed to another miracle that he didn't include, right? So we're going to do the wedding at Cana, and let's, how do I want to break this up? Well, we'll break it up how the commentary broke it up. So can I have a volunteer to read John chapter 2, verses 1 and 2?
I'll read it.
Thank you.
On the third day, there is a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. All
right. So John is laying the stage for us, right? Where are we? A wedding. Now, Cana, I know you all are up to date on your Old Testament geography. Where is Cana in relation to Judea?
North.
Just down the road.
Yeah.
Right. It is close, and north is the technical answer, but what I was looking for was outside. It's not in Judea.
No.
The first miracle that Jesus performs isn't among his people. It's among Gentiles. Or at least, potentially, it's in the land of Gentiles, if you will. Right? So we're seeing some of that. Now, when does this take place?
Early in his ministry, right?
So we know it's the first of the signs that he performs, right? But that, we haven't read that yet. So this is one of these contextual things. When does this take place?
On the third day.
What does it say?
Yeah, so it takes place on the third day, right?
Of what?
That's a good question, Bill. And there's been a lot of ink spilled over what exactly John means by that. One theory I ran across, which I don't like. Okay, here's a problem with especially this text. I don't know if it's going to continue all the way through. But every commentary I read that dealt with the wedding at Cana, even the Concordia commentary, which surprised me, read this allegorically. And what that means is to say there's a recognition that this actually happened, but there is an assumption that everything in here is symbolic. And yes, the way John writes, we get some of that, and you're able to do a little bit of it. But I was shocked at how little, practical historical exegesis the Concordia commentary did. But Wayer's smarter than me, so whatever. In this sense, we recognize that two things have happened so far in the book of John. All right, what's the first main event?
Picks his disciples.
That's the second main event. So he picks his disciples. That's number 2, right? So that's our second day, if we're looking at this kind of from a symbolic, historical standpoint.
His baptism.
Baptism, day 1. Disciples, day 2. Wedding, day 3. Now, there are some people who think that is the timeline. That, on quote-unquote Monday, he was baptized. On Tuesday, he called the disciples. And on Wednesday, he was at the wedding, right? Probably would have ended with a different day of the week. But anyway, I think that's, again, I don't read John strictly chronologically, and I think that's a stretch. But what we can see, and again, this is the same author as Revelation. We can see that John is using this Jewish concept, right? The third day, it has this godly sort of theme to it, right? We got Trinity and completion, that sort of thing. And we didn't read the line specifically, but Jesus will respond to his mother, "My hour has not yet come," right? This is Jesus beginning his active ministry is not a his choice thing. It's in God's time, right? And yes, I understand we got two natures stuff going on there, but you guys are all good on that, so we'll just go with the way I'm phrasing it here, right? So that's a potential here. What we're seeing here is that this is, whenever it's happening, that John is seeing a through line and a connection to everything else he's talked about so far. You have something, Jeff? Oh, you looked like you had something deeply insightful.
Like right off the bat, he's showing his human nature. So he's going to represent the events.
Yeah, so in St. Cyril of Alexandria, if you remember that guy, we talked about him. And he's one of the commentaries that I read for this because I have his John commentary. It's amazing. Granted, there's some pages in the commentary that are like the glossary and the table of contents in the edition that I have. I'm pretty sure Wedding at Cana starts on like page 90 of the commentary. This is chapter 2, 90 pages in. Wedding at Cana is also 3 pages of the commentary. So he spends an enormous amount of time on chapter 1, which is reasonable, right? Where I'm going with this is Cyril makes the argument that through inspiration, John sees into the future and controversies, and so he puts an extreme emphasis on the two natures of Christ, right? And I mean, we see it straight out the gate, right? What's the first introduction we get to Jesus? What's the conclusion, or the climax, rather, of our first introduction to Jesus in the book of John? It's not Luke, right, where Jesus is born, he's right, the Annunciation, that kind of stuff. It's not like that. It's not Matthew, where we're introduced to Jesus through a genealogy to connect him to the Old Testament, right? It's not Mark, where Jesus just appears, basically. How does John introduce us to Jesus?
Beginning was the Word.
All right, so that's how it starts out. The beginning was the Word. So who are we talking about? I'm going to say no because I'm being very pedantic right now. But yeah, I mean, yes, Jesus, right? Who is the Word?
God.
The Word is God. This is the first chapter of John is phenomenal, right? It's one of the first places that they make you translate in the seminary when you're learning Greek because, first of all, John in general is easy to read. He's not Paul, who's a nightmare. Participles, awful. John doesn't do that kind of nonsense. John chapter 1 is the biblical equivalent of C spot, see Spot run. It is so, it's delightful. And you feel so much confidence where you're like, I can do this. And then they throw a loop text at you and you're like, I can't do this. And it gets all that. And then you go Paul and you're toast. Anyway, John is both speaking very simply, extremely clearly, right? Unless you're a Jehovah's Witness, you're not going to get messed up on the grammar here. It's very simple, right? But he's also keying into deeply profound philosophical context of his day, right? His audience, the 1st, 2nd century, Hellenistic society would have completely outside the context of the Bible identified Logos with God. That's how Plato didn't use these terms, but they quickly become the terms he uses. This is how Plato describes God. The Platonic God is the Logos, the divine word, the unmoved mover, right? And so John is keying into this. And so when the first audience of John would have read, in the beginning was the Word, I'm going, yeah, we know that. Plato dealt with this already, right? You're not telling us anything new, John, right? And he said, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. They're like, okay, we know this, absolutely. I'm talking straight Hellenistic Greeks would have agreed with everything John's saying here, right? And we kind of get more where he's talking, and it's like, okay, maybe the Logos is the thing that enlightens the philosophers, right? That was a big idea there. And then, where is it? Verse 14, right? So we have been nailing this. The person I'm talking to you about is God. No questions about it, right? In the original context in mind. And then John says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory is the only Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. And a standard Hellenistic mind would have ripped the book in half and thrown it away and said, no, that's ridiculous, right? That is the countercultural aspect here, right? The Logos and the sarx. Sarx is flesh, right? It literally just means like meat. It's that same word. In Latin, it's carne, right? Carne asada. It just means like steak. This is the word God became meat. And that to most people in general is an offensive statement, right? Not to modern Christians because we've become kind of, this is palatable to us, which is a good thing, right? But to the ancient world, especially to the Greeks, where the Logos doesn't even do the creating. The Logos creates the thing that creates a thing that creates a thing that creates a thing that creates a thing that does the creating, so the Logos can stay far away from the nasty stuff, right? And John says, yeah, the Logos, same thing that you guys think it is. It took on meat. It became a human, and it dwelt among us, right? And the dwelt is an Old Testament loaded term. As far as I know, he invents this word. He turns tabernacle into a verb. And so John's doing a lot here, right? He's saying God, the divine nature, man, the human nature, are one. Not only are they one, but that one thing is dwelling among us like God of the Old Testament did in the tabernacle, right? So John has offended the Greeks. Now he's offending the Jews, right? Because what did you not do around the tabernacle? You all know this, but that was a bad way to ask the question. What's the one thing you know about the tabernacle that you're not supposed to do?
Not supposed to look behind the curtain.
You're right there. Yeah, you don't go to the Holy of Holies, right? You don't go to the mercy seat. That's where God is, right? John is saying here, not only does God, the divine essence, merge with humanity as we're going, right? The fleshy essence. But not only that, but he is the Holy of Holies that is now walking around people and talking to them and drinking wine with them, right, as we go forward, right? And then once we hit John the Baptist, we see that, well, not only that, but this God, who is the Holy of Holies, dwelling in flesh with his people, is also here to die, right? And so John lays out, in chapter 1, you can see how someone who is more prolific than me would write 90 pages on chapter 1, right? And they're really digging into this. And so, yes, we're seeing a huge, I can't remember which of you two this was, we're seeing a huge emphasis on the two natures of Christ already, straight from the beginning. Who's with Jesus?
Mother.
Yeah, so we hear of two people, right? His companions, we already heard about them, and his mother, right? Mary is, for what it's worth, already referred to here, not using the word itself, but as Theotokos. Do you guys remember that word? I want you to add it to your vocabulary. We've used it a couple of times. It's Greek, so you can impress all your friends. Theotokos. Joe, what does it mean?
Literally, God bearer.
Yeah, so Mary is the
Birth to God.
Mary is the one who gave birth to God, right? This is a critical confession of the Christian faith, right? We don't say it that way very often because we're not the Greek Orthodox Church, but it's an accurate confession, right? We talked about that a couple of times, once in our church history class and once in the heretics class, right? And John is attesting to that. This is one of those proof texts, right? Jesus, or, where is it? The mother of Jesus was there, right? Well, let's do that, right? A plus B equals C sort of deal, right? If Jesus is the Logos incarnate into, right, tabernacle, all that, and Mary is his mother, what does that make her? Mother of the Logos in human flesh, which is, again, a wildly countercultural statement. Right? Good. So we're setting the scene here. Questions on that? Because at some point we got to talk about, the miracle part of this. All right, cool. Volunteer for 3 and 5 as John tells us what the problem is. Thank you, Bill.
When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? Our hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you."
All right. How's Mary referred to here? Right. Well, so the problem is they're out of wine, right? And I've heard so many sermons on this, and it's not a wrong thing, and all sorts of conversation. Well, Mary likely had this special role in the wedding. I'm not interested in any of that cultural stuff, right? Because John doesn't deal with it, right? For some reason, Mary is the one coming up to Jesus and they're out of wine, go fix the problem. Right? And this is the second time that John has referred to Mary as the mother of Jesus, right? John is establishing that fact. What does Jesus say?
Woman.
He says, woman, right? Now, that seems kind of cold. When's the next time he says that?
At the crucifixion.
This is the last time we see Mary when she says, do whatever he tells you until the cross. Yeah. In the book of John, right? Yeah. And what does John say to Mary while he's dying on the cross?
This is your son.
Woman.
Yeah, specific, right? You were there, but you're missing the one word I wanted, right? Gune, right? Woman, behold your son, right? So this is not John trying to be like, Jesus was blowing his mom off, right? And I'm not associated with you. No, what John is doing here is what we call an inclusio. He has it's like brackets, right? In a math problem or in a book. John wants us to understand that everything in between these two things, this reference to, right, woman, my hour has not yet come, what's Jesus potentially referring to there? Yeah. Right? We have kind of a dual meaning here. One, our initial, right, if we're reading this for the first time, we might say, Jesus was saying it's not time for me to start my ministry, right? But as we look forward, we might say, because Jesus says this, right? My hour has not yet come. He says this more, right? So clearly that's not what he's getting at. He's getting at my hour is the crucifixion, that moment of the salvation of humanity, right? And it's both of these are connected. And what we want to see through this is not only that we're seeing the beginning and in some ways the end of Jesus' public ministry in the wedding at Cana through the crucifixion and the resurrection. Let's not separate those two events from one another, right? But we're also seeing that John is going to build us to that point, right? The conclusion of this portion of the gospel is the crucifixion, right? And what is Jesus doing here? We're going back down to verse 11, so we're jumping ahead. This, the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him, right? And then we see that same event, if you will. You can almost imagine this is the last of his signs that Jesus did and his disciples believed, right? You can kind of see that way the structure is connecting things.
At this point in time, I wonder if the guest knew of his divine nature.
Okay, so this is fascinating. Actually, tell you what, I'm gonna do it now. I have an extended quote that I want to read, right? So, and the question of, well, let's ask that question. Who knew about Jesus' nature at this point? By the end of this miracle, let's say. So his mother, right? The disciples in John's gospel, John identifies the disciples as, right, believing in it at this point, right? Now, in Mark, it's a different story. It's making a different point, right? But at least in John, the disciples believe that he is manifesting his glory, right? And that's what they're believing. That is Old Testament, or that, not Old Testament, that is first century Jewish code for, right? And showed that he was God, right? We'll see this very clearly with the calming of the sea, right? Where the disciples begin to worship Jesus. You don't worship anything that's not God, right? The Jews learned that lesson in the exile. Right? So the disciples, who else? Does anyone else?
The servants.
The servants. Now, what exactly everyone realizes, we are not sure, but it is noted that the servants knew what had happened. So there's a sermon. I'm going to read a portion of the sermon to you here. If I can find the correct bookmark. It's by a guy named Romanus Melodus, or Romanus the Melodious. This is a portion of his sermon. He sang his sermons. He chanted them, is what it was. And he asked this great question that I don't think any of us really, or I certainly don't think of. And the question is, how did Mary know? Right? Why would Mary go to Jesus with this problem? Right? And it's a long quote, but it's really good, so I'm going to read it. So, and I'm not going to chant it because I don't know how to chant this kind of thing. When Christ was present at the marriage feast and the crowd of guests were faring sumptuously, the supply of wine failed them and their joy was turned into distress. The bridegroom was upset. The cupbearers muttered unceasingly. There was this one sad display of penury, and there was no small clamor in the room. Recognizing it, the all-holy Mary came at once and said to her son, "They have no wine. But I beg you, my son, show that you can do all things. Thou, who has in wisdom created all things. We beg of you, Holy Virgin, from what sort of miracles did you know? How your son would be able to offer wine when he had not harvested the grapes, and had never before worked wonders, as John, inspired of God, wrote. Teach us how, when you had never gazed upon and never made trial of his miracles. How did you summon him to this miracle? For the question now posed to us in this matter is not simple. As to how you said to your son, give them wine. He who has in wisdom created all things. Let us learn the word which the mother of God said to, or mother of the God of all said to us. Listen, she said, my friends, instruct yourselves and know the mystery. I have seen my son working miracles even before this miracle. For I know that I did not know a husband, and I bore a son, beyond natural law and reason. And I know that I remained a virgin as I had been. Do you, O man, ask for a miracle greater than this birth? Gabriel came to me saying how this one would be born. He who has in wisdom created all things. After my conception, I myself saw Elizabeth call me mother of God before the actual birth. After the birth, Simeon praised me in song. Anna greeted me with joy. The Magi from Persia hastened to the manger. For a heavenly star proclaimed the birth in advance. Shepherds with angels heralded joy, and creation rejoiced with them. What would I be able to ask for greater than these miracles? Indeed, from them I have faith that it is my Son who has in wisdom created all things. Right? Again, it's a long quote, and I won't be chanting sermons to you anytime. But kind of this sense of, right, how did Mary know? And we see, and he goes to Luke, right, to answer that question, that this, even if you're ignoring, which you should, these spurious claims from Gnostic Gospels of other miracles that Jesus performed as a child, Mary has seen the miraculous aspects of Christ already. She seems to know that there's something different. Well, she knows there's definitely something different about Jesus, but she seems to have an insight here into the fact that Jesus could perform miracles. Right? Right, well, right, that's part of it, right? And, you know, I think we ask this question when we read Luke, right? What did Mary and Joseph actually know, right? Because when Jesus gets lost at the temple, they're both freaking out, and Jesus says, why are you freaking out? Like, you know I'm supposed to be here. Like, this should be normal for you, and it's not, right? And so, you know, we kind of ask these questions, and I think this is one of those places where we can see that Mary had a pretty decent idea of who Jesus was. Maybe certainly not the complete picture, but she definitely had insight that no one else really does. I do think it's also worth noting, right, that Jesus follows the fourth commandment, and now this is a huge thing in the Catholic Church, they're a big fan of this, right, that Jesus listens to his mother and follows her instructions as to when it's time for him to start his ministry. I wouldn't necessarily go that far, but he is, even though he addresses his mother in that woman, we see that the deep care that he has for her. We can also, through Mary here, if we're going to do some of that allegorical stuff here, we can definitely see that Mary is calling even our attention to the words of Jesus. Listen to him, right? Do whatever he tells you to do, right? I mean, that there could have been the thesis statement of John, right? Just do what he tells you to do, right? Some commenters go so far as to say that Mary is transitioning herself out of the role of the mother of Christ and into the role of the mother of the church, the expectant Israel waiting on the miracles of Jesus. I think that's a bit of a stretch, although there are parallels to that in Revelation 12, where Mary is seen as kind of this dual image of Israel, the church, I guess triple image of Israel, the church, and the mother of God. So who knows? Same author, so maybe there's some of that going on. But we see Mary points to Jesus, points to his words as the source of all things. All right, we got to finish this class at some point. So questions on that before we read basically the rest of the story? All right, do I have a volunteer that wants to go, what would it be, 6 through 10 for me? Thank you.
Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water, and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine, but you have kept the good wine until now.
All right, so we could spend all sorts of time on all the things that, at least for me, I always heard in all the sermons on this growing up, right? 6 stone jars, there's a lot of water in them, they're filled up to the brim so that you know for sure there's no funny business. And the early church does this stuff too, right? They're saying, no, this isn't just some illusion or some trick. Jesus is doing a miracle here, right? I think that that's been done. And I think my audience, at least, I'm not going to have to try and convince you that this was a real miracle and it wasn't Jesus just doing a parlor trick or something like that, right? I don't know. Maybe I'm misreading my audience, but I think I know you all well enough for that. If you have an issue there, talk to me later. That's a whole different kind of thing. I'm working on the assumption that you believe that this happened, right? I think that's safe. So what we want to do here is kind of ask that question, why is John including this period? And so another way to kind of say the same thing is, what is this telling us about Jesus, right? Especially contextually with what we know is already happened and what is coming in the book of John. One that is kind of a larger context and connects this to fulfillment of Old Testament is is wine as a theme of the Bible, right? So we see the Bible has all sorts of themes, right? Another Lenten series that I did was the mountains, right? If something's happening on a mountain, pay attention. Because most of the time, things that happen on mountains in the Bible are important, right? You can run through the themes of barren women giving birth. That was there was a national youth gathering prep Bible study, not for this NYG, the last one, and it said, ask your students about themes in the Bible. And the first example that they gave of a sample answer was, there's a lot of barren ladies in the Bible, and I had that in my head forever because no high schooler talks even remotely like that or would bring that up. I mean, it's just not. Anyway, it is true though, like barrenness and children are a huge theme, especially in the Old Testament. One of them, and we did deal with this a little bit, or a decent amount in the Micah series, if you remember a year and a half ago, or just a year ago, I guess, is wine. Right? So what role does wine play in the Old Testament? And I don't mean like Noah got off the ark and started drinking a lot of wine. That's not what I'm looking for, right? When the Bible is using wine as a symbol, or when the Bible talks about wine, what is going on with that? What is the picture that the Old Testament tries to pull out? So part of it is plentifulness, right? And that Micah passage really hits on that, right? Every man will sit under his fig tree and under his vine, right? This goes to how the feeding of the 5,000 is overcoming the effects of sin with the fecundity of the earth. Right? Wine means you got you got plenty, right? When we did Joel, this is a huge thing in Joel, right? The wine's gone, you will have new wine, right? So plenty. And provision. That's one of the themes that wine is used for in the Old Testament. What else?
In Isaiah, it's Messianic kingdom.
Yeah, and these two are very much connected to each other. And I think between the two, you get the whole sense, right? The sense of the Messianic kingdom and plenty, right? And by Messianic kingdom, we mean, right, eternal life with Christ. Right. Reading the whole Bible as a whole, right? And with that comes plenty and provision and not wanting and lacking anything. Wine is used to kind of encapsulate all of that. And when Messianic wine, if you will, is described, how is it described? Probably Joe's going to be our one for this one. How is it often described in the Old Testament, Joe? I'm thinking about the one where it's meat with the marrow and the bone and full of fat. Oh, okay. This is well-aged wine, fine wine. The best wine you've ever had is how it's described, right? Not only to show that joy and that provision, but just the glorious nature of things. How is this wine described? The wine here, John includes the description that this is the good stuff, right? Jesus brings the good stuff, right? The Messianic kingdom, provision, all of that kind of thing. We're seeing John reflecting these images to do what? All right, again, let's think context of John. What's John trying to tell us? What have we talked about so far?
Reinforce the divinity.
So definitely reinforcing the divinity. Let's be a little bit more precise about, you're right, but let's be a little bit more precise. What is the divinity doing? Providing.
Eating and drinking.
So eating and drinking like a person, right? That's in there too. He's bringing his kingdom, right? This is God dwelling with man. And what does it mean when God dwells with man? It means his kingdom comes with him, right? That's, again, we're pushing forward into John, right? But that's what the promises of eternal life are. The dwelling place of God is now with man. Not only that, but we're talking context with our occasion here, right? When you think wedding in the Bible, what should immediately come to mind?
Wedding feast.
Yeah, it's the eternal wedding feast, right? We can see Jesus, and this comes also with a lot of other biblical imagery, right? But we see Jesus sets himself up as the bridegroom of the church here, in a sense, right? And is beginning to show us that picture of God in this miraculous way, breaking into his creation, not necessarily he does break the rules, right, of how creation typically works, but he's doing more than that. He's breaking into creation to be in joy and fellowship with his creation, which is that, you might even say, foretaste of the feast to come, right, to use some liturgical language there. This is where we're getting that kind of stuff, right? Good. And you guys already hit this. If we're looking specifically from chapter 1, John's showing us proof that the Logos is the creator and that Jesus is that Logos and he is the creator, right? We got 2 quotes. They're good. The longer ones are good too, but I'm going to give you the summarized versions of them. Guy Maximus of Turin, he is speaking of this miracle, and he says, he who created water could change it into wine, right? He made water out of nothing. Making wine out of something is not a problem for him. And then Cyril of Jerusalem, he goes a step further and looks towards the sacramental aspect of this and says changing water into wine is no different than changing wine into blood, right? This is not he doesn't do transubstantiation stuff. He's way earlier than that. So we're okay as Lutherans saying that this is okay, right? But we see here reflections and images of the Eucharist, of Christ coming to us in his body and his blood in wine, right? Good. And we've already hit 11. This is the start of Jesus' ministry. We're looking to the beginning of what Jesus is doing here in the world. Questions on any of this before I finally get back to Bill and the wedding text aspect of this? All right. Let me see if I can, again, find the correct bookmark here. I'm reading you the Maximus of Turin quote. I forgot how good it is, right? Now, I used it once in a sermon, so now a long time ago, right? Addressing the expectant servants, he said, "Fill the jars with water." The servants promptly obeyed, and suddenly, in a marvelous way, the water began to acquire potency, take on color, emit fragrance, and gain flavor. All at once, it changed its nature completely. Now, this transformation of the water from its own substance into another testified to the powerful presence of the Creator. Only he who had made it out of nothing could change water into something whose use was quite different. Dearly beloved, have no doubt that he who changed water into wine is the same as he who from the beginning has thickened it into snow and hardened it into ice. It is he who changed it into blood for the Egyptians and bade it flow from the dry rock for the thirsty Hebrews. The rock that, newly transformed into a spring, was like a mother's breast, refreshing with its gentle flow and countless multitude of people. Church fathers are just good, right? Half the time when I say something really colorful and insightful, it's because I'm stealing it
What
from
you
them.
just read, though, doesn't seem to have anything to do with the act of marriage.
No, I opened to that and I thought this quote is really good. I'm going to read it anyway. So no, I'm still looking for the marriage one.
Stay tuned.
Yeah, right. Well, it's okay. So it's the same guy. Let's see if this is the one I actually wanted to do. No. So this is in the same sermon as the section I just read, and we'll do this. The Son of God went to the wedding so that marriage, which had been instituted by his own authority, might be sanctified by his blessed presence. He went to a wedding of the old order when he was about to take a new bride for himself through the conversion of the Gentiles, a bride who would forever remain a virgin. He went to a wedding even though he himself was not born of human wedlock. He went to the wedding not certainly to enjoy a banquet, but rather to make himself known by miracles. He went to the wedding not to drink wine, but to give it, right? So there's that picture of the sanctification of marriage in the new covenant. And then, just because I've referenced this before, we have Cyril of Alexandria, and he has some other thoughts about what Jesus is also doing there, right? As one who is renewing and refashioning the very nature of humanity for the better, Christ not only imparts his blessing to those already called into being, but also prepares grace in advance for those soon to be born, and sanctifies their entrance into existence. And yet, there is still another reason why Jesus was at this wedding. God had said to the woman, you're going to like this one, in pain you shall bring forth children. How else could we escape a condemned marriage unless this curse was annulled? This curse, too, the Savior removes because of his love for humankind. For he who is the delight and joy of all honored marriage with his presence so that he might expel the ancient sadness of childbearing, right? So, and I will say this,
I'm not going to comment on
right. I have the full quote. It's worse. He is, because that one you can be like, okay, maybe he's talking symbolically, right? This is one of the ways you can explain what in the world Cyril's talking about here is now that Christ has come into the world and sanctified marriage, childbearing, and humanity in general, and reestablishing the image of God. It's a very complicated book that Cyril's writing. Now children are not born unto death, and that being the pain of childbearing. You might be able to get that there. It is extremely clear that he is seemingly unaware that childbearing is still painful. When you read the full thing, it says, even the pain of childbearing has gone away. I don't think so. I don't know by experience, but... Now, it's also possible that Cyril of Alexandria had basically never spoken to a woman because he... I mean, it's because they were separate. He was a man. He got separated out. It's kind of how some of this went. But, yeah, it's kind of crazy. But despite the strange comments, the point there, and Bill, how this could be a good wedding text if done correctly, is to say, Jesus is sanctifying this marriage, right? Just as he's sanctified by his very presence, this wedding at Cana, he brought himself to bear and showed himself first at the union of two people, the covenant that he establishes, right? That union in the garden in perfection, right? And so there's a way to look at this as a really good wedding text. Now, that's probably not how most pastors who preach on this at weddings take it. Probably, oh, look, Jesus went to a wedding. We're at a wedding. Isn't that neat, right? I don't know. I have not had to preach on this for a wedding, so I can't speak to how I would do it. So, but good. Any questions that you have for the wedding at Cana? Wonderful. I will see you all next week then as we do whatever our next miracle is. That is escaping my mind right now. Anyway, as we look to some more of Jesus' miracles. So, let's take a minute then and close with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory,